I stared at the pile of white fabric on the floor, my breath turning sharp and metallic. My wedding gown, the gown I'd chosen 6 months ago, lay ripped down the front like someone had clawed through it with deliberate fury. The lace overlay hung in shreds, the delicate beading scattered across the carpet like broken promises. My mother-in-law, Patrice, stood behind me in the doorway, one hand dramatically pressed over her mouth in mock horror. Her pearl bracelet caught the morning light as she gestured wildly at the destruction. "Oh my goodness," she gasped loudly enough for everyone in the hallway to hear. Bridesmaids turned their heads. The photographer's assistant stopped mid-step. I told everyone she wasn't responsible enough to keep it safe. I warned Shane about this. My chest tightened as more guests began gathering near the bridal suite door. The whispers started immediately, rippling through the crowd like poison in water. I felt my throat close up, my voice trapped somewhere between rage and disbelief. I whispered, barely audible, "You did this." She smiled with her eyes only, cold and victorious. "Prove it, sweetheart." "My name is Harper. I'm 29 years old, and I work as an event coordinator in Charleston. I've spent the last 8 years of my life planning weddings for other people, managing every detail, anticipating every disaster, smoothing over family drama that wasn't mine to fix. I knew every trick, every backup plan, every way a wedding could go wrong. Somehow I forgot to prepare for the war happening at my own. The public humiliation over my shredded dress wasn't the start of this nightmare. It was just the explosion everyone finally witnessed. The fuse had been burning for 2 years, ever since the day I met Patrice Montgomery and realized she saw me not as her son's fiancée, but as an enemy who needed to be eliminated. Every smile she gave me was a blade. Every compliment came with a hidden insult. Every family dinner felt like a battlefield where I was the only one without armor. I inhaled shakily as the memories flooded back, because understanding how I ended up here required going back to the beginning. The first time I met Patrice was at a country club brunch 18 months before the wedding. Shane had been nervous that morning, adjusting his tie 3 times before we left the apartment. He'd warned me that his mother could be particular about who he dated, but he'd framed it like a quirk rather than a warning. She greeted me with a handshake as limp as a wet napkin and eyes sharp enough to cut through bone. Her gaze travelled from my shoes to my hair, cataloguing every imperfection with surgical precision. Her first words weren't, "Nice to meet you," or "I've heard wonderful things." They were delivered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So, Harper," she said, drawing out my name like it tasted bitter, "what exactly do you do for a living? Something creative, I assume." The way she said creative made it sound like unemployed or irresponsible. Shane jumped in to explain my job, but she'd already made her assessment. I smiled and answered politely anyway, but inside I felt the first warning bell ringing loud and clear. This woman didn't just dislike me. She'd decided I wasn't worthy before I'd even spoken. So, the little cuts started immediately after that brunch. Every family dinner became a minefield. Every holiday gathering felt like an interrogation. Every phone call that Shane took from his mother ended with him looking exhausted and me feeling smaller. Patrice had perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, the subtle insult disguised as concern. "I wouldn't wear that if I were you, dear. It's a bit young for someone your age. You're very emotional, aren't you? Shane's always been attracted to dramatic women. You're lucky my son doesn't care about social class. He's always been generous that way." Each comment landed like a paper cut, small enough to seem petty if I complained, but deep enough to sting for days. Shane brushed them off every single time. "That's just Mum," he'd say with a helpless shrug. "She means well. She's protective." But I knew better. I'd seen the calculation in her eyes, the way she watched my reactions like a scientist studying a lab rat. Patrice wasn't just protective, she was strategic, and I was her target. Whenever Shane left the room, to get drinks, to answer the door, to take a phone call, Patrice transformed. The polite mask slipped away, replaced by something colder and more honest. She'd lean closer across the dining table, tapping her wineglass with one perfectly manicured nail, and whisper the same sentence that became her chorus. "You'll never be good enough for him, ha. You know that, don't you?" Sometimes she'd add variations. "Girls like you don't last in families like ours." Or, "Shane will realize his mistake eventually. They always do." But the core message never changed. She wanted me gone, and she wanted me to know she was working toward that goal with every breath she took. My heartbeat became the drum beneath her cruel melody. At first, I'd tried to win her over with kindness, with effort, with proof of how much I loved Shane, but kindness only gave her more ammunition. Every vulnerability I showed became a weapon in her hands. I realized too late that Patrice didn't want a daughter-in-law. She wanted surrender. The night Shane proposed, I'd expected joy. We'd gone to the beach at sunset, and he'd gotten down on one knee with his grandmother's ring, a beautiful vintage piece that had been in his family for 3 generations. I cried happy tears. He cried too. For those few perfect hours, nothing else existed except us and our future together. Then we went to tell his parents. Patrice barely looked at the ring when we showed her. She glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds before her gaze shifted back to Shane's face, searching for something I couldn't name. Instead of congratulations, she murmured, "Oh, so this is really happening." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Shane's father offered warm congratulations, but Patrice just sat there, sipping her wine slowly, her expression unreadable. Then she began listing reasons why the wedding should be smaller, delayed, or handled by people with better taste and more experience. I knew what she really meant, handled without me. She wanted control, or she wanted chaos. Either way, I was the obstacle. As a wedding coordinator, I knew every vendor in Charleston. I had relationships with florists, caterers, photographers, venues, people I'd worked with for years who trusted my judgment and professionalism. I'd built my reputation on reliability and attention to detail. Patrice knew that, and she used it against me. She started calling my vendors herself, pretending to be helpful. She told the florist I kept changing my mind about arrangements and couldn't make decisions. She called the caterer to say I was unreliable with payments and had emotional problems. She even contacted the photographer I'd worked with on dozens of weddings to warn him that I might cause a scene on the wedding day and that he should be prepared. Every time a vendor called to confirm something unusual, I heard Patrice's fingerprints all over the conversation. They'd ask careful questions, trying to figure out if I was actually unstable or if something else was happening. I had to spend hours rebuilding trust, explaining without sounding paranoid. It was exhausting, and that was exactly what she wanted. Then I realized something powerful that changed everything. Patrice wanted me to explode. She needed me to lose my composure, to scream at her in front of Shane's family, to prove every accusation she'd been planting like seeds in their minds. She wanted me to be the unstable, emotional, dramatic woman she'd been describing to everyone who would listen. So I stopped giving her what she wanted. I went still. Quiet, calculated. I responded to her insults with calm smiles. I answered her invasive questions with brief, polite responses. I stopped defending myself because I realized that defense implied guilt. When she criticized my choices, I simply said, "Thank you for your input," and moved forward without changing anything. The shift unsettled her. I could see the confusion in her eyes when her barbs didn't land the way they used to. And I learned something crucial about power. When people underestimate a calm woman, they hand her every weapon she needs to defeat them. They get careless, they overreach, they reveal themselves. The rehearsal dinner arrived 3 days before the wedding. I'd planned everything carefully. A beautiful evening at a waterfront restaurant, speeches from loved ones, a celebration of the marriage we were about to begin. Shane's father gave a touching toast about love and commitment. My maid of honor made everyone laugh with stories from college. Then Patrice stood up. I didn't know she'd prepared a speech. She hadn't mentioned it, hadn't asked to be included in the program. But there she was, glass raised, commanding everyone's attention with the confidence of someone who believed she owned every room she entered. "Marriage is hard," she began, her voice carrying across the restaurant, "especially when one person is, how do I say this delicately, temperamental and difficult to live with." People laughed nervously, unsure if this was humour or hostility. My throat burned with humiliation, but I kept my face perfectly neutral. She continued for another minute, each sentence a veiled criticism of my character, my background, my worthiness. When she finally finished, the room sat in uncomfortable silence. I clinked my glass calmly and stood. "Funny," I said softly, meeting her eyes. "I thought tonight was to celebrate love, not to critique the bride." A few cousins choked on their wine. Patrice's eyes flashed with fury, but she sat down without another word. Shane squeezed my hand under the table. He'd finally heard it too. The cruelty he'd been excusing for months. Later that night, I walked toward the bathroom and heard Patrice's voice coming from the restaurant's patio. She was on her phone, speaking in the sharp, confident tone she used when she thought no one was listening. "I'm telling you, Margaret, she'll crack before the wedding," Patrice said. "She's not stable enough for this family. Shane just can't see it yet because he's blinded by infatuation. But mark my words, she'll show her true colours soon and he'll realise what a mistake this is." She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Then she laughed, cold and certain. "I've planted enough seeds. People are already questioning her judgment. One more incident, and this whole wedding will fall apart, and Shane will thank me for it eventually." I stood frozen in the hallway, my hands shaking. She wasn't just hoping I'd fail. She was actively engineering my downfall like it was a hobby, a project, a game she intended to win. That was the night I made my decision. I wouldn't fight her directly. I wouldn't give her the confrontation she craved. Instead, I'd let her fight herself. I'd let the truth show up on its own stage, in its own time, in front of everyone. The next morning, I went into full coordinator mode. I emailed every single vendor personally with detailed confirmations. I locked everything down with written instructions and updated contracts. Most importantly, I sent a polite but firm message to each one. For any changes or questions about our wedding, please only follow instructions that come directly from my email address. Do not accept calls or requests from anyone else, including family members. I didn't mention Patrice by name. I didn't have to. The vendors I'd worked with for years understood immediately. Several replied with messages like, "Got it. We'll keep everything locked down," or "Don't worry, we've dealt with difficult family members before." No accusations, no drama. Just professional boundaries that would expose whoever tried to cross them. I wasn't building walls to keep Patrice out. I was building a stage where her actions would be impossible to hide. Every move she made from this point forward would leave evidence, and evidence doesn't lie. 3 days later, her first attempt failed spectacularly. The bakery forwarded me an email with a note that made my heart race with vindication rather than anger. "Harper, we received this request and wanted to confirm you truly want black icing instead of white for your wedding cake. Also, the message requested we add red roses, which you specifically said you were allergic to. Just wanted to double check before we made any changes." The email they'd forwarded was from Patrice. She'd tried to change the entire cake design to something dark and dramatic, completely opposite of what Shane and I had chosen together. She'd signed it Harper Montgomery, even though that wasn't my name yet and wouldn't be for another week. I didn't call her. I didn't confront her privately. Instead, I replied to the bakery, copying Shane, his father, and yes, Patrice herself into the email chain. "No, that was absolutely not from me. That request is fraudulent. Please proceed with our original cake design exactly as planned. Thank you for checking." Patrice's name sat in the CC line like a spotlight illuminating a stage. She didn't reply. She didn't call. She didn't acknowledge it at all. That silence tasted sweeter than any wedding cake frosting ever could. The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect weather. Clear skies, gentle breeze, 72 degrees. I woke up feeling hopeful despite everything. Shane had finally started seeing his mother's behaviour clearly after the rehearsal dinner incident. His father had pulled him aside to express concerns about Patrice's unusual fixation on preventing the wedding. I had my backup plans in place. I had a team of people who loved me surrounding me in the bridal suite. For a few beautiful hours, I thought maybe we'd made it through the worst of it. Maybe Patrice had finally realised she couldn't stop this marriage and had backed off. And I was wrong. I was so incredibly, devastatingly wrong. Because Patrice hadn't given up. She'd just been waiting for the perfect moment to strike, the moment when I'd be most vulnerable, most exposed, most unable to defend myself. She'd been planning her masterpiece of sabotage, and she'd timed it for maximum devastation. The morning was about to go from perfect to catastrophic in the space of a single heartbeat. I'd left my wedding gown hanging in the bridal suite while I went downstairs for breakfast with my bridesmaids. We were gone for maybe 40 minutes, just long enough to eat and take some getting-ready photos in the garden. When I returned to the suite, chatting and laughing, I pushed open the door and stopped breathing. My gown lay on the floor in a heap of destroyed fabric. Not fallen, destroyed. The bodice was ripped down the front in a clean, deliberate line. The delicate lace sleeves were shredded. Beading that had taken someone hours to sew by hand was scattered everywhere, like evidence at a crime scene. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a gown that had slipped off the hanger. This was sabotage, calculated, vicious, and timed perfectly to cause maximum chaos an hour before the ceremony. Patrice stood in the doorway behind me, her performance already in full swing. "Oh my goodness," she gasped, her voice pitched loud enough to carry down the hallway. Bridesmaids gasped. Guests who'd been walking past stopped and stared. The photographer's assistant immediately started taking pictures of the scene, the destroyed dress, my shocked face, the gathered crowd. This was going to be the story everyone remembered about my wedding. Not the love, not the vows, the drama, the destruction. Exactly what Patrice wanted. As I stood there trying to process what was happening, trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster, Patrice moved closer. She leaned in, pretending to comfort me with a hand on my shoulder, and whispered so only I could hear. "Told you, sweetheart. You're not wife material. You can't even keep a wedding dress safe. What makes you think you can handle being a Montgomery?" Her breath was warm against my ear, her words like acid. She was enjoying this, the shock on my face, the tears threatening to spill, the crowd of witnesses seeing me at my most vulnerable and humiliated. This was her triumph, the moment she'd been working toward for 2 years. But something inside me didn't break the way she expected. Instead, something clicked into place with perfect clarity. I felt my spine straighten. My breathing steadied. The panic dissolved, replaced by something colder and far more powerful. I turned to face her directly and I smiled. "Patrice," I said softly, my voice carrying just enough for the nearest bridesmaids to hear, "thank you." The confusion that flickered across her face was absolutely delicious. She didn't understand. How could I be thanking her for destroying my wedding gown? What kind of reaction was this? I could see her brain working, trying to figure out what she'd missed, what piece of her plan had gone wrong. She'd expected tears, hysteria, maybe even a physical confrontation that would prove I was exactly as unstable as she'd been claiming. Instead, I was calm, smiling, almost amused. Because Patrice had made one critical mistake in her campaign against me. She'd forgotten that I was a professional wedding coordinator with 8 years of experience handling disasters. She'd forgotten that I knew every trick, every backup plan, every way to save a wedding from catastrophe. And most importantly, She'd forgotten that I'd been expecting her to try something exactly like this. "Natalie," I said to my maid of honor, my voice steady and clear, "would you please bring in the backup gown?" The confusion in the room intensified. Backup gown. Several guests murmured to each other. Someone whispered, "Did she know this would happen?" My maid of honor disappeared into the adjoining room and returned wheeling a garment rack with a dress bag hanging from it. Yes, I'd known. Maybe not the exact method, but I'd known Patrice would try one last sabotage. So I'd done what I always did for my clients. I'd prepared a contingency plan. Natalie unzipped the garment bag with a flourish, revealing the second wedding gown I'd had delivered to the venue the night before. It was different from my original choice, simpler, more elegant, with clean lines and minimal beading that somehow suited me even better. I'd fallen in love with it during a fitting, but chosen the other dress instead. Now I was grateful I'd kept this one as insurance. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Guests who'd gathered in the hallway to witness my humiliation now watched in confusion as my disaster transformed into triumph. I stepped toward the backup gown, running my fingers over the smooth silk. Patrice stood frozen near the doorway, her confident smirk fading into uncertainty. This wasn't in her script. She'd expected devastation, not preparation. She'd expected me to crumble, not adapt. For the first time since I'd met her, I saw genuine fear flicker across her face. She was losing control of the narrative she'd worked so hard to build. But the story wasn't over yet. In fact, the next twist was about to change everything even more dramatically than either of us expected. Because while Patrice had been executing her sabotage, someone else had been watching. As I slipped behind the changing screen to put on the backup gown, the seamstress who'd arrived early to help with final adjustments pulled me aside. Her name was Miss Rivera, and I'd worked with her on at least 20 weddings over the years. Her face was pale, her voice urgent and low. "Harper," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the door. "I need to tell you something. I saw someone in your suite earlier before breakfast. I was in the hallway steaming bridesmaid dresses, and I saw a woman go into your room. She was in there for maybe 5 minutes, and when she came out, she looked around like she was checking if anyone had seen her." My stomach flipped cold. "Can you describe her?" Miss Rivera nodded, her voice dropping even lower. "Older woman, perfectly styled blonde hair, navy blue dress, pearl bracelet. She had a small clutch bag that looked heavy, like something was inside. I didn't think much of it at the time, because I assumed she was part of the wedding party." She'd just described Patrice down to the specific pearl bracelet she always wore. My pulse turned to ice, then fire. This wasn't just sabotage. It was premeditated destruction with a witness who could verify exactly when and how it had happened. I didn't need to confront anyone myself. The truth was building its own momentum. As I finished getting dressed in the backup gown, which fit perfectly, thank God, whispers began spreading through the venue like wildfire. Miss Rivera had quietly mentioned what she'd seen to one of my bridesmaids. That bridesmaid mentioned it to a cousin. The cousin mentioned it to her mother. Within 15 minutes, the story was circulating through the entire wedding party and into the guest population. "Someone saw Shane's mother near the bridal suite earlier. Did you hear? She was carrying something in her purse. My cousin said she heard Patrice talking about stopping the wedding last week. I saw her holding scissors near the gift table this morning. I thought she was helping with decorations. The rumors built themselves without any input from me. I didn't fuel the fire, I didn't add details or encourage speculation, but I didn't stop it either. The truth was doing exactly what truth does when it's been suppressed for too long. It was erupting in every direction at once, impossible to contain or control. And Patrice, who'd spent 2 years carefully crafting her narrative about my instability, was about to watch her own story unravel in front of everyone. The ceremony was supposed to start at 4 o'clock. By 3:45, I was ready, wearing the backup gown, my makeup fixed, my hands steady. Shane stood at the altar looking confused by the commotion, but happy to see me walking toward him. I loved him so deeply it hurt. He was kind and genuine and nothing like his mother. That's why I needed everything to happen naturally without my interference. I wasn't going to accuse Patrice on our wedding day. I wasn't going to create a scene or force Shane to choose between us in front of 200 guests. But her lies and manipulations were already dying on their own. The truth had developed its own momentum, and I simply had to let it run its course. The officiant began the ceremony with traditional words about love and commitment. Shane held my hands, his eyes shining with emotion. For a few perfect moments, nothing else existed except us and the promises we were about to make. The destroyed dress, the whispers, the drama, all of it faded into background noise. Then Patrice stood up from her seat in the front row, and the entire atmosphere shifted. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for an appropriate moment. She simply stood, smoothed her navy dress, and cleared her throat loudly enough to interrupt the officiant mid-sentence. A collective groan rippled through the guests, subtle but definitely present. Even Shane's father put his head in his hands. "I have something to say," Patrice announced, her voice projecting across the garden venue with theatrical precision. "I cannot, in good conscience, watch this ceremony continue without speaking the truth." My heart hammered, but I kept my face neutral. Shane stepped slightly in front of me, protective but uncertain. The officiant looked completely lost, his Bible still open in his hands. 200 guests sat in stunned silence. "This wedding shouldn't be happening," Patrice continued, gesturing dramatically towards me. "Harper is unstable. She's manipulative. She even destroyed her own wedding dress this morning to get attention and sympathy, to paint me as some kind of villain. She's been doing this for months, creating drama, making herself look like a victim." Gasps echoed through the crowd. A few people muttered to each other. But then something happened that Patrice clearly wasn't expecting. A voice called out from the guest section, steady, clear, and absolutely certain. "That's not true." Miss Rivera, the seamstress, stood up from her seat near the back. She was small and quiet by nature, the kind of person who normally avoided conflict. But something about Patrice's brazen lie, spoken so confidently in front of so many people, pushed her past her usual reserve. She stepped into the aisle, her voice growing stronger with each word. "That's not true at all. I saw you, Mrs. Montgomery. I saw you go into the bridal suite this morning before the dress was destroyed. You were alone in there, and when you came out, you looked around like you were checking if anyone had noticed." The crowd erupted. Several other guests stood up immediately, their own pieces of the puzzle suddenly making sense. A woman I recognized as Shane's aunt called out, "I saw her too. She was near the bridal suite carrying something in her purse." Another voice from the side, "I heard her on the phone last week saying the wedding needed to be stopped. She was holding scissors this morning. I saw them." Each testimony built on the last, creating an avalanche of evidence that Patrice couldn't deny or deflect. Her face drained of all colour. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. You're mistaken," she stammered, her confident mask cracking into pieces. "This is ridiculous. I would never—" But the crowd had already turned. The very audience she'd tried to perform for, the witnesses she'd wanted for my humiliation, had become witnesses to her own destruction instead. Patrice looked desperately towards Shane, reaching out one hand as if he could somehow rescue her from this moment. Her eyes were wide, pleading, filled with a panic I'd never seen in her before. She'd spent 2 years so certain of her power, so confident in her ability to control every narrative. Now that foundation was crumbling beneath her feet. "Shane," she said, her voice breaking. "Shane, you know me. You know I would never do something like this. These people are lying. She's turned everyone against me." But Shane just stood there, his hand still holding mine, his face a mixture of sadness and betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but absolutely clear. "Mom," he whispered, "how could you?" The question hung in the garden air like smoke. Patrice reached for his arm, still trying to maintain her grip on him, still believing she could fix this with the right words. But Shane stepped back, putting physical distance between himself and the woman who'd raised him. That single step backward was the loudest sound in the entire garden, louder than any accusation, louder than any testimony. It wasn't just that she'd been exposed as the saboteur, it was that she'd been rejected by the one person she'd claimed to be protecting. Her own son, the center of all her manipulations, had chosen his wife over her lies. The officiant, bless him, somehow pulled himself together. After a long, tense moment of silence, he cleared his throat and asked if we wanted to continue. Shane and I looked at each other and nodded simultaneously. Yes, we absolutely wanted to continue. We'd come here to get married, and no amount of drama was going to stop that from happening. The ceremony restarted. Shane's father gently but firmly asked Patrice to sit down or leave, and after a moment of humiliated hesitation, she sank back into her seat. But the shift in energy was unmistakable. Where she'd once commanded respect and attention, now there was only awkward pity and clear judgment. We exchanged our vows, and I felt my pulse steadying for the first time in months. When Shane lifted my veil and kissed me, the garden erupted in genuine cheers, louder and more heartfelt than they probably would have been without the drama. People were celebrating not just our marriage, but the victory of truth over manipulation, authenticity over performance. As we walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, I saw Patrice sitting rigid in her seat, her face a mask of devastation. I didn't win by fighting her. I won by being still while the truth screamed for me. The reception was beautiful, the food was perfect, the band was excellent, and Patrice wasn't included in a single wedding photo. The photographer who'd witnessed everything quietly made sure she was cropped out or positioned outside the frame of every important shot. It wasn't cruelty. It was just the natural consequence of her actions. Throughout the evening, guests avoided her. People who'd once laughed at her jokes now turned away when she approached. The social circle she'd commanded so confidently had dissolved in the space of a single afternoon. There was no shouting, no revenge speech from me, no dramatic confrontation. Just silence, the kind that crushes a person harder than anger ever could. She left early, slipping out a side door with her head down, her perfect composure completely shattered. Shane watched her go with sad eyes, but didn't follow. His father went after her, but even he looked disappointed rather than sympathetic. As Shane and I danced our first dance under string lights in the garden, I realized something profound. Self-worth isn't proved by pleasing people who are determined to hate you. It's proved by refusing to let them break you. Patrice had spent 2 years trying to crack my foundation, to prove I was too weak for her family. Instead, she'd shown everyone exactly who she was, and I walked into my marriage stronger than ever, untouched by her chaos, unshaken by her cruelty, and completely free.